The air inside Ethelgard was not merely air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, a tangible substance spun from money and silence. It smelled of old leather, truffle oil, and a faint floral perfume that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a scent designed to soothe the titans of industry who dined within its hallowed halls. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, their light refracting through 100,000 facets, casting a soft, forgiving glow upon the polished marble floors and the heavy damask tablecloths. The only sounds were the hushed murmur of conversations discussing billion-dollar mergers and the delicate, almost musical clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain plates. It was a cathedral dedicated to the worship of wealth, and its staff were the silent, invisible clergy, trained to move with a ghostly grace that never disturbed the sanctity of the space. They were figures in the background, essential but unnoticed, their purpose to facilitate the effortless comfort of the powerful, their own lives and stories completely erased the moment they donned their starched black uniforms. This was a world built on a rigid hierarchy, and within these walls, power was the only language that truly mattered, a language spoken not in words, but in the weight of a gaze, the cut of a suit, and the casual, dismissive wave of a hand. Lena moved through this gilded sanctuary like a phantom, her presence a study in professional invisibility. Her black shoes, polished to a mirror shine, made no sound on the marble. Her hands, steady and sure, refilled water glasses with a motion so fluid it was barely perceptible, the crystal carafe seeming to float from one table to the next. Her expression was a mask of placid neutrality, a carefully constructed facade that betrayed none of the tempest raging within her. Every movement was precise, economical, honed by months of repetition into a seamless ballet of service. To the patrons of Ethelgard, she was part of the decor, no more significant than the ornate floral arrangements or the heavy velvet drapes. They saw a waitress, a simple functionary in their grand narrative. They did not see the mind behind her eyes, a mind that once navigated the labyrinthine complexities of classical Arabic poetry and deconstructed the socio-linguistic structures of entire civilizations. They did not see the scholar who had been on the cusp of a brilliant academic career, a life of intellectual pursuit she had sacrificed without a second thought, trading university libraries for the sterile quiet of a hospital room and the hushed opulence of this restaurant. Behind the calm mask, Lena's thoughts were a constant, aching litany of numbers and memories, the cost of her father's round-the-clock nursing care, the price of the experimental medications that kept the worst of his pain at bay, the looming mortgage on the small family home she was desperate to keep. Each perfectly plated dish she carried, each bottle of vintage wine she presented, translated in her mind into another day of solvency, another small victory against the tide of debt that threatened to swallow them whole. The image of her father was seared into her consciousness, a permanent resident of her inner world. She saw him not as the vibrant, laughing man who had built a small but proud textile import business from nothing, but as he was now, a statue of a man, confined to a bed, his world shrunk to the four walls of his room. The stroke had stolen his voice, his mobility, his life's work, but it had not stolen the light from his eyes. On good days, he would follow her with his gaze, a flicker of the old intelligence still burning deep within, and in those moments, every sacrifice, every humiliation she endured in this temple of excess, became not a burden, but a shield protecting his dignity. The hushed reverence of the dining room was shattered not by a loud noise but by a presence. Marcus Thorne did not enter Ethelgard, he invaded it. The air itself seemed to part for him, the low hum of conversation faltering as heads turned. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and ambition, his tailored suit clinging to a frame that spoke of expensive personal trainers and a ruthless discipline. A watch worth more than Lena's annual salary gleamed on his wrist, a beacon of his success. He didn't follow the maitre d' to his table. He led him, his stride long and impatient, as if the very act of walking on the same floor as others was a personal affront. He waved a hand dismissively at the offered chair, a gesture that spoke volumes, communicating that the world was his to command, and its inhabitants were there merely to anticipate his needs. He was flanked by a man whose quiet demeanor and expensive thobe identified him as a potential investor from the Gulf, a prize to be won. Thorne's voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble of authority, a sound that cut through the restaurant's delicate acoustics, turning the space into his personal boardroom. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The drama that was about to unfold in this temple of fine dining was more than just a clash of personalities. It was a battle between two worlds, between the illusion of power and the unyielding force of hidden knowledge. Marcus Thorne, CEO of Thorne Capital, saw the world as a chessboard, and the people in it were merely pawns to be moved, sacrificed, and forgotten. He had built an empire on the ruins of smaller, weaker competitors, and he had never once stopped to consider the human cost of his victories. Tonight he was performing, showcasing his supposed global sophistication for his guest, a man whose wealth could elevate his own to staggering new heights. He believed himself to be the master of this universe, completely unaware that the quiet waitress refilling his water glass was not a pawn, but a queen in disguise, waiting for the perfect moment to make her move. To impress his guest, Thorne began to speak in Arabic. It was a clumsy, transactional version of the language, the kind learned from a corporate tutor, designed for closing deals, not for communication. The consonants were harsh, the grammar fractured, a brutish assault on a language Lena knew to be as intricate and beautiful as a woven tapestry. She could hear the subtle wince in the investor's polite smile, the almost imperceptible tightening of his eyes that betrayed his discomfort. Thorne, however, was deaf to the nuances, blinded by his own performance. He was a man wielding a scalpel like a club, utterly oblivious to the delicate artistry he was butchering with every mispronounced word. Lena continued her silent work, her movements unchanged. But inside, the linguist in her was recoiling. It was an academic offense, a minor irritation, a prelude to the far greater crime that was about to be committed. She felt a familiar pang of loss for the world of scholarship she had left behind, a world where language was treated with reverence and respect, not as a cheap parlor trick to flaunt one's shallow worldliness. Thorne leaned towards his guest, a conspiratorial smirk spreading across his face. He gestured with his chin towards Lena, who was carefully polishing a water glass on a nearby service station. Then, in his broken, jarring Arabic, he spoke the words that would seal his fate. "Look at this simple girl," he said, his tone dripping with a casual, thoughtless contempt. "They work like machines, completely unaware. We could plan a coup in their language, and they wouldn't even blink." The words sliced through the air, landing in Lena's ears with the force of a physical impact. The world around her seemed to slow down, the clinking of silverware fading into a distant echo. The heavy crystal glass in her hand suddenly felt weightless. For a moment she was not in a restaurant, but suspended in the silent, suffocating space between one breath and the next. The insult was not just directed at her, but at everyone like her, everyone deemed invisible. Everyone whose inner life was considered null and void by men like Marcus Thorne. It was the casual cruelty of it that struck her most, the absolute certainty of his own superiority. The insult landed, and in the space of a heartbeat, it connected to the deepest wound in Lena's soul. The phrase, "simple girl," echoed in her mind, and instantly, an image flooded her senses. Her father, slumped over his desk years ago, his face ashen, staring at a letter bearing the insignia of a shell corporation. The jargon-filled pages had been a language of their own, a form of corporate warfare he couldn't comprehend, detailing the hostile takeover that had bled his life's work dry. The stress, the sleepless nights, the humiliation of losing everything he had built, that was the coup they had planned, and he hadn't understood their language until it was too late. The stroke had followed soon after, a physical manifestation of a broken heart and a ruined spirit. This man's casual insult was not a separate event. It was the final, ugly verse in a long, tragic poem of destruction. A cold fury, clean and hard as diamond, solidified in her veins. Her hands, which should have been trembling, became perfectly still. Her breathing, which should have been ragged, grew slow and deliberate. The waitress was gone, and in her place stood the scholar, the daughter, the avenger. Marcus Thorne, basking in the glow of his own perceived wit and completely oblivious to the transformation he had just catalyzed, turned his full attention to Lena. He saw only a blank-faced servant, a prop in his little play. The silence that followed his remark was, to him, proof of her ignorance. He decided to amplify his performance, to drive the point home for his guest. He raised his voice just enough for the surrounding tables to hear, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He looked directly at her, his eyes cold and dismissive, seeing not a person, but an object, a thing to be used for his amusement. He leaned back in his chair, the very picture of untouchable power, and issued the challenge that would unravel his entire world. "If you're so smart," he dared, his voice a condescending drawl that dripped with privilege, "translate this insult for us." The question hung in the super-chilled air of Æthelgard, a grenade with a pin already pulled. He expected fear, confusion, or at worst, a stammered apology. He was not prepared for wisdom. He was not prepared for the storm he had so arrogantly summoned. A profound stillness descended upon the table, a pocket of absolute silence in the otherwise murmuring room. Thorne's challenge, meant to be a final, crushing display of his superiority, hung in the air like a toxic vapor. For a fraction of a second, Lena did not move, did not even seem to breathe. Her entire being was focused inward, gathering the scattered fragments of her past, her pain and her knowledge into a single, unbreakable point of light. The image of her father, his eyes clouded with the confusion and despair of financial ruin, flashed behind her eyelids. She felt the ghost of his hand, once strong enough to lift her onto his shoulders, now trembling and frail, and the casual, venomous words of the man before her became the very embodiment of the faceless cruelty that had shattered her family. This was not merely an insult. It was a continuation of a war he had started years ago, a war he didn't even remember fighting. The waitress, the invisible servant, the simple girl, receded like a tide, leaving behind the scholar, the prodigy, the daughter whose love was a force of nature. Then she moved. It was not a sudden or jerky motion, but a slow, deliberate realignment of her entire physical presence. Her shoulders, which had been held in a posture of deferential service, straightened and squared, adding an imperceptible but palpable height to her frame. She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but with the serene confidence of a master in her own domain. The placid, neutral mask she had worn for months dissolved, revealing the sharp, piercing intelligence that lay beneath. Her eyes, which had been carefully trained to avoid direct contact, now fixed upon the potential investor, bypassing Marcus Thorne completely, as if he were a piece of furniture, an irrelevant obstacle in her line of sight. The air around her seemed to shimmer with a new energy, a quiet authority that was more powerful than Thorne's boisterous dominance. The shift was so complete, so profound, that the investor, a man accustomed to reading the subtle power dynamics in any room, leaned forward slightly, his own polite mask of detached interest replaced by one of genuine, startled curiosity. He was witnessing a transformation, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who dealt in high stakes, that something extraordinary was about to happen. Lena turned her head, a graceful, measured movement, and addressed the investor from the gulf directly. She did not speak in the broken, transactional Arabic that Thorne had butchered. Instead, her voice emerged, clear and resonant, in the flawless formal Arabic of diplomats and scholars. The pronunciation was perfect, the cadence melodic, a stark and beautiful contrast to the grating, clumsy sounds Thorne had produced. The language flowed from her not as a memorized script, but as a living, breathing entity, a part of her very soul. She chose her words with the precision of a surgeon, each one selected to convey not just meaning, but respect for the listener and the language itself. To the investor, it was like hearing a beloved piece of music played by a virtuoso after suffering through a child's clumsy recital. The very sound of her voice was a testament to a depth of knowledge and a cultural fluency that Thorne, with all his wealth and tutors, could never hope to purchase. It was a display of pure, unadulterated intellectual power, and it immediately established her as the true authority at the table. In this perfect classical Arabic, she began her translation. She did not soften the blow or attempt to paraphrase. She delivered Thorne's insult with a chilling, verbatim accuracy that stripped away all his bluster and left only the ugly, naked contempt beneath. He said she articulated her voice a calm, level instrument of truth, that you and he could plan a coup in my presence, and that I would be too simple, too ignorant, to understand a single word of it. She let the words settle in the space between them, a poison now properly labeled and identified. The investor's eyes, which had been wide with surprise, now hardened with a flash of anger and embarrassment. He was a man of honor, and he had just been made an unwilling accomplice to a boorish and disrespectful act. He glanced at Thorne, a new, cold appraisal in his gaze. Thorne himself was momentarily stunned, his brain struggling to process the impossible reality that this waitress, this non-entity, was fluent in the very language he had used to mock her. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps deny or backtrack, but he was too slow. Lena was not finished. Before Thorne could gather his scattered thoughts, before the shock in the room could curdle into outrage, Lena's gaze shifted, moving from the investor to land directly on the billionaire himself. She held his eyes, and for the first time he saw not a servant, but an equal, a judge. The fury that had been a cold, solid core within her now fueled a quiet, devastating brilliance. She continued to speak in that same beautiful, classical Arabic, her voice now imbued with a weight of centuries of wisdom. She was no longer just a translator. She was a conduit for a truth far older and more powerful than Thorne's fleeting corporate empire. She recited a famous, ancient proverb, one known throughout the Arab world, a line of poetry so potent and precise it was a weapon in its own right. The words were like polished stones, smooth and heavy, each one landing with immense impact, their meaning resonating on multiple levels, cultural, intellectual, and deeply personal. It was a masterstroke, a move on a chessboard he didn't even know he was playing. Al-Jahilu yatakallamu bilughatin mu'ara, she recited, her voice a low musical murmur that seemed to silence the entire restaurant. Walamma wal hakim yujibu bilughat al-ruh. The words, which meant, the fool speaks in a borrowed tongue, but wisdom answers in the language of the soul, echoed in the opulent space. The investor gasped, a sharp intake of breath. It was not just the proverb itself, but the context in which she had delivered it, a perfect, surgical strike that not only exposed Thorne's ignorance, but also elevated her own position from one of a victim to one of a sage. It was a checkmate delivered with the grace of a poem. The investor looked at Lena with something approaching awe. He saw not a waitress, but a woman of profound intellect and courage, a person of substance who had just performed an act of incredible intellectual and moral bravery. In that single moment, Lena had won his complete and total respect, an asset more valuable than any contract Thorne could ever hope to offer him. Marcus Thorne was frozen. The sensation was not one of cold, but of a searing, paralyzing heat that flooded his entire body. His face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, was now a canvas of disbelief and raw, exposed humiliation. He did not understand the precise meaning of the proverb she had spoken, but he understood its effect. He saw it in the admiring gaze of his potential partner, a gaze that had been directed at him only moments before. He heard it in the sudden, absolute silence of the surrounding tables, where diners had stopped their conversations to stare. He felt it in the way the power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted, tilting away from him and coalescing around the quiet, dignified figure of the waitress. His business Arabic was a cheap tool, a counterfeit currency, and she had just exposed it by paying a debt with pure gold. The foundation of his self-perception, that wealth equated to intelligence, that power was a substitute for wisdom, cracked beneath him, and for the first time in a very long time, he was left utterly speechless, adrift in a sea of his own making. The ice of his shock did not last long. It shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. Humiliation for a man like Marcus Thorne was an intolerable state, a wound to his ego that could only be salved by brute force and retaliation. A dark red flush crept up his neck, staining his cheeks. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped along his cheekbone. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated global CEO dissolved, revealing the petty tyrant that lay beneath. He was no longer performing for his guest. He was a cornered animal, lashing out with the only weapon he had left, his power. He could not defeat her intellectually, so he would crush her professionally. He would remind her of her place in his world, a place he defined and controlled. The air crackled with his rage, a palpable force that made the other diners flinch and the restaurant staff freeze in place. The cathedral of wealth was about to be desecrated by a very ugly, very human tantrum. "What did you say?" he snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl that bore no resemblance to the confident baritone he had used earlier. The question was not a request for information. It was an accusation, a prelude to an execution. Before Lena could even respond, he slammed his fist down on the heavy oak table. The force of the blow was immense, rattling the silver cutlery and sending a shockwave through the delicate crystal glasses. A splash of ruby-red wine, a vintage that cost more than Lena's weekly rent, leaped from a glass and stained the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. The sound was a gunshot in the silent room, a shocking act of violence that tore through the carefully curated atmosphere of Æthelgard. All pretense of civility was gone. This was no longer a battle of wits. It was a raw, primal assertion of dominance, the roar of a king who had just been publicly dethroned and could not bear the shame. The restaurant manager, a man named Julian whose entire career was built on his ability to remain unflappable, came scurrying over, his face pale with panic. He had seen powerful men dine here, had catered to their every whim, but he had never witnessed such a vulgar and explosive loss of control. He approached the table with a practiced, placating smile, his hands held out in a gesture of appeasement. "Mr. Thorne, is everything all right? Can I get you something?" he asked, his voice a nervous, high-pitched whisper. He avoided looking at Lena, his instincts telling him to isolate the source of the problem, to offer up a sacrifice to appease the angry god who sat at his most profitable table. He was a creature of the system, and the system dictated that the customer with the deepest pockets was always, under any circumstances, right. His loyalty was not to his staff, but to the reputation and balance sheet of the establishment. Thorne ignored the manager's fawning. His cold, furious eyes were locked on Lena. He pointed a trembling finger at her, his hand shaking with the force of his rage. "Fire her!" he bellowed, the word echoing through the now tomb-like silence of the dining room. "Fire this insolent little nobody right now, or I will personally see to it that this restaurant is a parking lot by next year." The threat was not idle. Both he and the manager knew he had the resources and the ruthlessness to make good on it. He was leveraging his immense financial power to erase the source of his shame, to punish the person who had dared to show him his own reflection. He was turning a personal humiliation into a corporate crisis, forcing the manager to choose between one employee's livelihood and the entire restaurant's existence. It was the ultimate act of a bully, using a sledgehammer to kill a butterfly. Julian, the manager, looked from Thorne's enraged face to Lena's preternaturally calm one. He saw no insolence there, only a quiet, unshakable dignity that seemed to infuriate the billionaire even more. But Julian's mortgage, his children's private school tuition, and the livelihoods of the 50 other people who worked at Æthelgard were all flashing before his eyes. He was trapped, a pawn in a game far above his pay grade. He made the only choice a man in his position could make. He turned to Lena, his expression a wretched mix of apology and resignation. "Lena," he said, his voice barely audible, "please clear out your locker. We have to let you go." "I'm sorry." The words were a capitulation, a surrender to the raw power of wealth. Justice in this temple had no currency. The system was working exactly as it was designed to, protecting the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Lena felt a strange sense of detachment as she heard the words. There was no surge of fear or panic, no desperate plea to keep her job. The cold, diamond-hard fury within her had burned away all lesser emotions. Being fired from this job was not a defeat. It was a liberation. She had stood up, spoken her truth, and honored her father's memory in a way that mattered more than any paycheck. She gave the manager a single, small nod of understanding, a gesture of grace that he did not deserve. She did not look at Marcus Thorne again. To do so would be to acknowledge his victory, and she knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very bones, that the real battle had not even begun. This was merely the opening skirmish. She had lost a job, but she had found her voice, and she was beginning to understand the true nature of the enemy she was facing. As a junior waiter nervously escorted her towards the staff exit, a new sound cut through the tense atmosphere of the room. It was Marcus Thorne's voice, now restored to its arrogant, commanding tone. As he desperately tried to salvage his business deal and repair his shattered ego, he was speaking loudly, making sure the entire room could hear him, attempting to re-establish his dominance. He laughed a false, booming laugh and launched into a story about a particularly ruthless acquisition his firm had recently completed, a classic tale of corporate conquest designed to impress his guest with his killer instinct. He wanted to project an image of strength, to show that the little incident with the waitress was nothing more than a momentary distraction, an insignificant gnat he had swatted away without a second thought. He was trying to rewrite the narrative in real time, to erase the memory of his own profound humiliation from the minds of everyone present. He was boasting now, his words filled with the predatory jargon of his trade. He spoke of synergy, of hostile takeovers, of maximizing shareholder value. And then he said the name. He dropped it casually, a footnote in his grand story of success, a testament to his own cleverness. "We used a shell corporation to mask the initial stock purchase," he bragged, a smug grin returning to his face. "A little entity called Aegis Holdings. They never even saw us coming." The name, Aegis Holdings, sliced through the air and struck Lena with the physical force of a lightning bolt. Time stopped. The sounds of the restaurant faded away. The face of the waiter guiding her out blurred into nothingness. There was only that name echoing in the vast, silent chambers of her memory, a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Aegis Holdings. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost that had haunted her family for half a decade. She saw it instantly, as clearly as if it were yesterday. The crisp, white letterhead on the document spread across her father's desk. She saw the fine print he couldn't decipher, the legalistic language that was a weaponized form of obscurity, designed to confuse and overwhelm. She remembered the color draining from his face as his accountant tried to explain the mechanics of the hostile takeover, the way his proud, independent business, built over 30 years of honest work and fair dealings, had been devoured from the inside out by a predator he couldn't see and didn't understand. The stress had gnawed at him, stealing his sleep, his appetite, his spirit. The stroke had been the final, brutal consequence of that silent, paper-based violence. The coup Thorne had joked about planning was not a hypothetical. It was a historical fact, and her family had been the territory he had conquered. The connection was so staggering, so cosmically, cruelly perfect, that she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was not a random encounter. This was not about a thoughtless insult spoken in a restaurant. This was fate, or something like it, delivering the architect of her family's destruction directly to her, wrapped in a package of his own unbearable arrogance. The man who had ruined her father, who had stolen her future and forced her into this life of servitude, was the same man who had just mocked her ignorance. The cosmic irony was so thick she could taste it, a bitter, metallic tang on her tongue. The personal insult that had ignited her fury now seemed small, almost insignificant, compared to the magnitude of this revelation. The fight was no longer about her dignity. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming a life that had been stolen. She was outside now, standing on the cold, wind-swept pavement of a New York City street. The sounds of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of pedestrians. It was a different world from the hushed artificial sanctuary of Athelgard. The chilly night air hit her face, a sharp, clarifying slap that cut through the shock. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. They were trembling with a new and terrible purpose. The grief and helplessness that had been her constant companions for years began to recede, burned away by the white-hot flame of this newfound knowledge. She was no longer just a caregiver, no longer just a waitress. She was the sole inheritor of her father's legacy, and she now had a target for the justice he had been denied. The invisible man in the corporate tower had a face and a name, and he had made the fatal mistake of showing it to her. Her despair, the cold dread about her father's medical bills, and the looming uncertainty of unemployment was still there, a knot in the pit of her stomach. But it was overshadowed by a larger, more powerful emotion: resolve. She thought of her father, lying in his bed, his brilliant mind trapped inside a body that would not obey him. She thought of the spark that still lit his eyes, a spark of intelligence and love that no corporate raider could ever extinguish. That spark became her North Star. She would not let his story end in a quiet, tragic defeat. His life's work would not be a mere footnote in Marcus Thorne's quarterly report. She would make his story heard. She would make his name matter. She would turn her knowledge, the very thing Thorne had mocked, into a weapon so precise and so powerful that it would dismantle his entire empire of lies. She reached into the pocket of her worn coat and pulled out her old, cracked smartphone. Her fingers, now steady and sure, scrolled through a list of contacts she hadn't looked at in years. It was a list from another life, a life of academia, of libraries, of intellectual debate. She passed by the names of old classmates, of fellow researchers, until she found the one she was looking for. The name on the screen represented a bridge back to the world she had been forced to abandon, a world where research, evidence, and truth were the most powerful forces of all. It was the name of a man who had believed in her, who had been devastated when she had dropped out of the PhD program, a man who understood the intricate dance between language, ethics, and power. He was more than a professor. He had been her mentor. The name was Professor Alistair Finch. He had been her PhD advisor, a towering figure in the world of linguistics, but he had since pivoted his focus, becoming one of the country's leading experts on corporate ethics and forensic linguistics, the study of how language is used to conceal and perpetrate white-collar crime. He had once told her that the most dangerous lies were not the outright falsehoods, but the truths that were carefully wrapped in layers of impenetrable jargon and legalistic misdirection. He taught that language could be a weapon, and Lena now understood that she needed a master weaponsmith to help her forge her own. He was the one person in the world who would understand not just what had happened in the restaurant, but the greater significance of Aegis Holdings. He was her first and most important potential ally. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment. It was a call that would change everything, a step across a threshold from which there would be no return. To make this call was to declare war. It was to commit herself to a path that would be difficult, dangerous, and uncertain. She took a deep breath, the cold city air filling her lungs, and she thought one last time of her father's eyes. She thought of the silent, unwavering love she saw in them every single day. That was all the strength she needed. She pressed the button, and as the phone began to ring, she felt the last vestiges of the timid, invisible waitress fall away forever. The voice that answered the phone would not be speaking to a simple girl. It would be speaking to Lena, the scholar, the researcher, the avenger. And she had a story to tell, a case to build, and a war to win. The first move in her counterattack had just been made. Professor Alistair Finch's voice was exactly as Lena remembered it, a warm, resonant timbre that seemed to carry the weight of the thousands of books he had read. It was a voice that had once guided her through the complexities of medieval Arabic poetry and championed her dissertation proposal with fierce pride. Now, filtering through the small speaker of her phone in the cold New York night, it was an anchor in a swirling sea of chaos and revelation. She explained everything, her own voice low and steady, recounting the scene in the restaurant not with the breathless panic of a victim, but with the detached precision of a scholar analyzing a text. She described Thorne's clumsy syntax, the cultural faux pas, the insult, and her response. When she finally spoke the name, Aegis Holdings, a profound silence stretched across the line, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence. Finch did not gasp, nor did he exclaim in shock. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its academic warmth and had been replaced by something colder, harder, like tempered steel. He recognized the name instantly, a ghost from a past research project on predatory corporate acquisitions. He told her to come to his university office first thing in the morning and to bring every piece of paper her father had ever kept from his business. The war had just gained its first general. The next morning, Lena entered the hallowed halls of the university she had been forced to abandon, a ghost returning to her own past. The air smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint electric hum of intellectual energy, a scent so familiar it made her ache with a sense of loss for the life that had been stolen from her. Professor Finch's office was a chaotic sanctuary, a fortress built of books stacked floor to ceiling with narrow pathways carved between them. He greeted her not with pity, but with a fierce protective anger in his eyes. He cleared a space on a large table, and together they began to unbox the history of her father's life's work. Faded invoices, leather-bound ledgers filled with his elegant handwriting, and the final brutal stack of documents from Aegis Holdings. For hours they worked under the warm glow of a desk lamp, the city's noise a distant murmur below. Finch, with his expertise in forensic linguistics, pointed out the weaponized ambiguity in the legal clauses, the deliberately confusing terminology designed to obscure intent, a form of violence committed with ink and paper. He explained that Thorne hadn't broken the law in a way that was easy to prove. He had expertly bent it until it shattered. Their path to justice would not be through a courtroom. Not initially, it would have to be through the court of public opinion. Their first task was to build a map of Thorne's corporate labyrinth. Lena, fueled by black coffee and a righteous fury that burned brighter than any exhaustion, rediscovered the researcher she had once been. The university's extensive digital archives became her hunting ground. For days that blurred into sleepless nights, she sat in a quiet carrel in the library's basement, the glow of a monitor illuminating her determined face. She cross-referenced SEC filings, shareholder reports, and archived articles from financial journals. Aegis Holdings was just the beginning, a single thread in a vast, tangled web. She uncovered a dozen other shell corporations, all registered in Delaware or the Cayman Islands, with names that were intentionally bland and forgettable. Apex Consolidated, Sterling Ventures, Meridian Global. They were ghost companies, existing only on paper, designed to act as predators, to swallow smaller businesses and strip them of their assets before disappearing back into the corporate ether. Each company she unearthed was a gravestone for a family business like her father's, a silent testament to the lives and dreams Thorne had casually crushed on his ascent to power. She wasn't just fighting for her father anymore. She was fighting for all of them. The work was a slow, painstaking process of digital archaeology. Lena felt as though she were piecing together the shards of a shattered civilization, trying to reconstruct the story of its fall. She taught herself to read financial statements with the same critical eye she had once used on ancient manuscripts, identifying the subtle anomalies, the transactions that flowed in circles, the assets that appeared and vanished like magicians' tricks. Professor Finch acted as her guide, her mentor in this new, dark language. He would look over her findings each evening, circling a name here, highlighting a date there, connecting dots she hadn't seen. He explained the concept of the kill and dissolve acquisition, Thorne's signature move. Buy a company with its own money through leveraged debt, extract all value for shareholders, and then let the hollowed-out husk of the business declare bankruptcy, leaving employees and creditors with nothing. It was a perfectly legal form of destruction, a sociopathic business model that thrived in the shadows of regulatory loopholes. The more she learned, the colder the fury inside her became, transforming from a raging fire into a focused blue-white flame of absolute resolve. After 2 weeks of relentless digging, she hit a wall. The public record could only take her so far. The paper trail of the shell corporations led to a series of offshore accounts and law firms that were black boxes, legally impenetrable fortresses designed to protect the secrets of men like Marcus Thorne. The frustration was immense, a physical weight that settled in her chest. She would stare at the screen until the names and numbers swam before her eyes, feeling the same suffocating helplessness her father must have felt all those years ago. One night, sitting alone in the library as a cleaning crew vacuumed the floors around her, she almost gave up. The sheer scale of Thorne's power, the sophisticated architecture of his deception, seemed insurmountable. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the distant, glittering lights of the city, each one a world away from her own. Then, the image of her father's face appeared in her mind's eye. Not the broken man in the bed, but the proud, vibrant man he had been, his eyes alight with passion as he described the intricate patterns of a hand-woven tapestry from Damascus. He had built his business on beauty and trust, and Thorne had destroyed it with ugliness and deceit. Her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She would not be defeated by a fortress of paper. Professor Finch, seeing the wall she had hit, proposed a new, more dangerous strategy. If they couldn't break down the fortress from the outside, they needed to find someone who was already inside, or at least had once held a key. They needed an insider, a disgruntled former employee, someone with a conscience who had been discarded by the Thorne capital machine. This began the second phase of her investigation, a hunt for a human being. Using her linguistic and research skills in a new way, Lena began to scour the internet not for corporate filings, but for human traces. She analyzed years of press releases from Thorne Capital, noting the names of junior executives and analysts who were quoted once or twice and then vanished. She cross-referenced these names on professional networking sites, looking for sudden, unexplained gaps in employment, for bitter or cryptic comments on industry forums. She was searching for a ghost, a whisper of discontent in the loud, triumphant roar of Thorne's corporate narrative. It was a search that required immense subtlety and a deep understanding of human nature, of how ambition sours into resentment, and how silence can be a sign of a story waiting to be told. Her search eventually led her to a man named Arthur Kendrick. His digital footprint was faint, almost erased. He had been a junior compliance officer at Thorne Capital for 18 months before disappearing from the company's roster 5 years ago. Right around the time of the Aegis Holdings acquisition, there was no glowing farewell message on his professional profile, just a quiet transition to a low-level accounting job in a different state. Lena found him through a comment he'd left on an obscure online forum for financial ethics. A single, bitter sentence posted 3 years ago. Some mountains are built on a foundation of bones. It was a poet's sentiment from a numbers man, a crack in the facade that revealed a deep well of disillusionment. It took her another week to find a secure, anonymous way to contact him, using an encrypted email service recommended by Finch. She didn't mention her father or Aegis Holdings. She simply wrote, "I'm a researcher looking into the foundations of certain mountains. I believe you might have seen the blueprints. I would like to hear your story." The response, when it came 2 days later, was a single word: where. They arranged to meet in a quiet, forgotten corner of the New York Public Library, a neutral ground far from the gleaming towers of Wall Street. Arthur Kendrick was a man who seemed to be trying to make himself smaller, his shoulders hunched, his eyes constantly scanning the room. He was haunted. Lena sat opposite him at a heavy oak table, the air thick with the smell of old books and unspoken secrets. She told him her story, quietly, factually, without melodrama. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, then a dawning horror. He remembered Aegis Holdings. He had been the one tasked with filing the initial paperwork, a young, ambitious officer who had been told not to ask too many questions. He had seen the deliberate undervaluation of her father's company's assets, the predatory loan structures, but he had been too scared and too eager to climb the corporate ladder to say anything. The guilt, he confessed, his voice a ragged whisper, had eaten away at him ever since. He had been fired shortly after, when he finally worked up the courage to voice a minor ethical concern about a different deal. Arthur had not been a willing accomplice, but a silenced one. He had lived in fear of Thorne's reach for years, but Lena's courage ignited a long-dormant spark of his own. He told her that the real evidence, the documents that would prove fraudulent intent beyond any doubt, were not in any digital archive. Thorne was too smart for that. The most damning records, the internal memos and strategy documents, were kept in physical form in a secure, climate-controlled deep storage facility in New Jersey, a veritable tomb of corporate secrets. Arthur had never been inside, but he knew the protocols. He knew the name of the third-party company that managed it, and he still had his old Thorne Capital ID card, long deactivated but physically identical to the current ones. He couldn't get her inside, but he gave her the key to the first door, the layout of the system, the name of the facility, and the knowledge of what she needed to find. He gave her a target, a physical location for the truth she had been chasing through the digital ether. The plan they devised with Professor Finch was audacious, bordering on reckless. It was a high-stakes gamble that relied on Lena's ability to become someone else entirely. Finch, using his network of old friends and former students, managed to get his hands on a high-quality forger, an artist of identity who created a fake ID and a set of credentials for Lena. She was to become Dr. Anya Sharma, a postgraduate researcher from the University of Chicago, granted special access to the archives to study corporate storage trends for her dissertation. The story was thin, but plausible enough to get her past the front desk. The most difficult part was her appearance. She cut her hair, wore thick-rimmed glasses she didn't need, and adopted a different posture, the slightly stooped, inward-looking stance of a lifelong academic. She practiced her new identity for days, modulating her voice, creating a backstory, becoming so immersed in the role that the lines between Lena the waitress and Anya the researcher began to blur. She was no longer just an avenger. She was an infiltrator, preparing to walk into the heart of the enemy's fortress. The day of the infiltration was cold and overcast, the gray sky pressing down on the anonymous, sprawling landscape of suburban New Jersey. The storage facility was a featureless concrete monolith, a building with no windows and a single, heavily reinforced steel door. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the rental car she sat in. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run. The fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. But then she closed her eyes and saw her father, his hand in hers, his fingers giving a faint, reassuring squeeze. The fear did not vanish, but it settled, transformed into a focused, controlled energy. She was not doing this for herself. She was the vessel for a justice that was long overdue. She stepped out of the car, smoothed the lapels of her borrowed blazer, and walked towards the steel door, her steps even and measured. The invisible waitress who had once served Marcus Thorne was about to enter the vault where he kept his darkest secrets. Inside, the air was cold, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone and recycled air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the climate control systems. A bored-looking security guard barely glanced at her forged credentials before buzzing her through a second set of doors into a long, white corridor. The archives themselves were a vast, cavernous space, filled with rows upon rows of towering, automated shelving units that moved silently along tracks in the floor. It was a library of corporate sins. Using the file numbers Arthur had given her, she entered a code into a keypad. A section of the massive wall of boxes began to move, a mechanical leviathan awakening from its slumber, delivering the specific container she sought. Her hands were trembling as she opened the cardboard box. It was filled with manila folders, each one neatly labeled. And there it was, a folder marked Project Artisan, Final Strategy. Project Artisan. That's what they had called the destruction of her father's business. A sick, cynical joke that made bile rise in her throat. She took the folder to a small, sterile viewing room, her every movement monitored by a camera in the corner of the ceiling. She worked quickly, her researcher's training taking over. She spread the documents out, her eyes scanning for keywords, for signatures, for the single piece of evidence that would transform suspicion into certainty. And then she found it. It was a 2-page internal memo, printed on Thorn capital letterhead. It was not a legal document, but a strategic one, a cold-blooded battle plan. The memo, written by Thorn himself to his senior legal counsel, explicitly detailed the plan to use Aegis Holdings to leverage the target's existing assets to fund its own acquisition, and to aggressively devalue intangible assets post-merger to trigger loan covenant defaults. It was a clear, unambiguous blueprint for fraud, but it was the final sentence, scrawled in Thorn's own arrogant handwriting at the bottom of the page, that sealed his fate. "Let's get this done," he had written. "It's a small fish, but the textile patterns might make for good office art." The casual, dismissive cruelty of that final line struck Lena with the force of a physical blow. Her father's life's work, his passion, his legacy, reduced to a decorative afterthought. In that moment, all the pain, all the grief, all the quiet, simmering rage of the past 5 years coalesced into a single, perfect point of clarity. This memo was the smoking gun. This was the language of the soul of a man who had none. She quickly took out a miniature scanner, a device the size of a pen that Finch had procured for her, and carefully, meticulously, she digitized every page in the folder. Each quiet click of the scanner was a nail being hammered into Marcus Thorne's corporate coffin. She placed the original documents back in the folder, returned the box to the automated shelf, and walked out of the facility, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not look back. The security guard waved her through without a second glance. She was invisible once more, but now she carried a weapon of immense power. Back in Professor Finch's office, they looked at the digitized memo on his large monitor. The scrawled, arrogant handwriting was undeniable. Finch brought in a trusted colleague, a retired district attorney, who now taught at the university's law school, to look at the evidence. The man, a seasoned veteran of countless white-collar crime cases, read the memo, looked at the supporting documents Lena had gathered, and let out a long, low whistle. He confirmed their suspicions. While the acquisition itself had been structured to be technically legal, this memo proved clear and malicious fraudulent intent. It was the kind of evidence prosecutors dreamed of, a direct window into the perpetrator's state of mind. It was enough, he said, to trigger a full-blown SEC investigation and likely criminal charges. They finally had him. The question was no longer about finding the proof. It was about how to use it for maximum impact, to ensure Thorne could not use his wealth and power to bury it. As if on cue, Marcus Thorne himself began to move. He was a predator who had sensed a subtle shift in the wind, an unknown threat moving on the periphery of his vision. The inquiry at the storage facility, though seemingly innocuous, had been flagged. A quiet call from his head of security had informed him that the Project Artisan files had been accessed. He didn't know by whom or why, but his paranoia, the same instinct that made him so ruthless in business, kicked into high gear. He began to enact a scorched earth policy, a frantic attempt to cover his tracks. Orders were given to shred documents, to wipe servers, to intimidate former employees into silence with new, ironclad non-disclosure agreements. He was trying to erase a history that Lena now held in the palm of her hand, on a small, encrypted flash drive. His panicked movements were the frantic thrashings of a powerful beast that had just realized it was caught in a trap and did not yet know where the teeth were. His actions only confirmed his guilt, creating a sense of urgency for Lena and her allies. They had to strike before he could completely bury the rest of his crimes. The final plan began to take shape, a strategy born from a fusion of academic rigor, legal expertise, and a daughter's unyielding love. They would not go to the authorities first. Thorne's lawyers would tie them up in court for years, bleeding Lena dry of resources she didn't have. They needed to detonate this bomb in a way that would cause immediate, irreversible, and public devastation. Finch discovered the perfect venue. The annual Thorne Capital Pioneers of Philanthropy Gala, a lavish, self-congratulatory event where Marcus Thorne played the part of the benevolent civic leader. It was his grandest stage, a night where he surrounded himself with the city's elite, with politicians, with investors, and with the media. He would be at his most confident, his most arrogant, his most vulnerable. The gala was in 1 week. It was there, in the glittering heart of his own empire, that Lena would deliver her final, devastating answer. The stage was now set, not for a simple revenge, but for a public reckoning. In the final days leading up to the gala, a profound transformation settled over Lena. The exhaustion and fear were still present, but they were now distant companions, overshadowed by a calm, unshakable sense of purpose. She was no longer a victim reacting to a world that had been cruel to her. She was an agent of change, a strategist executing a meticulous plan. She visited her father every day, reading to him from his favorite books of poetry, the cadence of the ancient verses, a soothing balm for both of them. She didn't tell him about Thorne or her investigation. She simply let him feel the new strength and confidence that radiated from her. He seemed to sense it, his eyes following her with a look of profound pride. On the evening of the gala, she stood before the mirror in her small apartment. She was not wearing her waitress uniform or the drab disguise of the researcher. She wore a simple, elegant, dark blue dress, one she had bought from a consignment shop. It was a garment that spoke not of wealth, but of dignity. In her hand, she held a small, inconspicuous clutch. Inside it, nestled next to a copy of her speech, was the small flash drive, a tiny vessel containing the truth that would shatter an empire. Her expression in the mirror was calm, her eyes clear and focused. The simple girl was gone. The scholar had done her research. Now the warrior was ready for battle. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was Marcus Thorne's personal Olympus, a celestial space where he could play Zeus for an evening. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 hothouse flowers and the even more intoxicating aroma of concentrated wealth. Light from colossal crystal chandeliers, each one a glittering galaxy, refracted through the champagne flutes of senators, hedge fund managers, and society doyens, painting the room in a soft, golden, and deeply forgiving light. The gentle murmur of conversation was a symphony of power, a low hum of deals being made and reputations being polished. Lena moved through this glittering crowd not as a phantom, but as a deliberate and focused presence. Her simple blue dress was an island of quiet dignity in a sea of ostentatious couture. No one noticed her, their eyes trained on the stage where Marcus Thorne, the evening's host and self-proclaimed king, was preparing to speak. Lena's heart was a steady, rhythmic drum against her ribs, a metronome counting down the final moments of an empire. In her small clutch, the flash drive felt as heavy as a king's ransom, a tiny repository of truth in a room built on magnificent illusions. She was not afraid. She had walked through the fire of her family's ruin and emerged, not burned, but forged. Marcus Thorne stepped up to the podium, bathed in a warm, adoring spotlight. He was in his element, his voice a smooth, confident baritone, as he spoke of corporate responsibility and the noble duty of the wealthy to give back. He was a master performer, his words weaving a beautiful tapestry of benevolence that completely concealed the rapacious greed that was the true engine of his life. He made a joke, and the room filled with the sound of polite, sycophantic laughter. He announced a record-breaking donation from his own foundation, and a wave of reverent applause washed over him. He was untouchable, a titan on his gilded stage, basking in the reflection of his own manufactured greatness. It was during the designated open mic portion of the evening, a time for others to announce their pledges, that Lena began to move. She walked from the back of the ballroom, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant, but measured and inexorable. A few heads turned, a ripple of curiosity moving through the crowd. Who was this unknown woman approaching the stage with such quiet, unannounced purpose? Thorne, momentarily distracted from the applause, squinted into the crowd, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at this unscheduled interruption of his coronation. He did not recognize her. To him she was just another face, another non-entity in his grand universe. She reached the small set of stairs leading to the stage and ascended, her posture perfect, her gaze locked on the podium. The whispers in the ballroom grew louder now, a current of confusion and intrigue. The event's security staff, caught off guard, began to move towards her, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of the head from Professor Finch, standing near the side of the room, made them pause. Lena reached the microphone, her small frame dwarfed by the massive video screen behind her, which currently displayed the gleaming logo of Thorne Capital. She looked out at the sea of powerful, expectant faces, and for a fleeting moment, the image of her father, his face etched with the pain of failure, flashed in her mind. That image did not weaken her, it solidified her. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it was so clear, so perfectly modulated that it cut through the murmuring of the crowd and commanded an immediate, absolute silence. She did not introduce herself by name. She began with a story. "Tonight, we celebrate philanthropy," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But I want to talk about the cost of the fortunes that make this philanthropy possible. I want to tell you about a small, family-owned business that imported artisan textiles, a business built on 30 years of honest work." Marcus Thorne's smile had frozen on his face, a rictus of confusion and dawning apprehension. He started to signal to the security guards, but it was too late. Lena had the room's complete, undivided attention. She continued her story, her words painting a vivid picture of a proud man, his love for his craft, and the sudden, inexplicable corporate assault that had bled his company dry. She spoke of a shell corporation, a ghost entity used to mask a hostile takeover, and as she spoke, she reached into her clutch, pulled out the flash drive, and calmly inserted it into the laptop on the podium. Then, she said the name. The shell corporation was called Aegis Holdings, she declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. And it was a subsidiary of Thorne Capital. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. On the massive screen behind her, the Thorne Capital logo dissolved, replaced by a high-resolution scan of the first document, the labyrinthine legal notice that had destroyed her father's life. Thorne's face went white. The blood drained from it so fast he seemed to shrink inside his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He lunged for the microphone, but Lena sidestepped him with a dancer's grace, her eyes never leaving the audience as she continued her devastating, methodical presentation of the truth. "Mr. Thorne used a perfectly legal, if morally bankrupt, strategy to destroy my father's company," Lena explained, her voice now imbued with the cold precision of a prosecutor delivering their closing argument. But what he didn't count on was his own arrogance, his own need to document his conquests. And then, the final, fatal piece of evidence filled the screen. It was the internal memo, in all its damning clarity. The camera operators in the room, sensing the story of a lifetime, zoomed in on the screen, projecting Thorne's own words, his own handwriting. To every monitor in the ballroom, the audience could read the blueprint for fraud, the cold, calculating strategy to devalue and consume. and then they saw the final, scrawled sentence at the bottom, a line of such breathtaking cruelty that it sucked the very air from the room. "Let's get this done." It's a small fish, but the textile patterns might make for good office art. A profound, tomb-like silence fell. The only sound was the frantic clicking of a dozen press cameras. Lena turned, her entire body now facing the man who had just been stripped naked, in front of the world he had spent a lifetime trying to conquer. She looked directly into his eyes, a judge delivering a final, unappealable sentence. And in a voice that was both a whisper and a thunderclap, she spoke in flawless classical Arabic, the words echoing with the weight of centuries. "الجاهل يتكلم بلغة معارة," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "ولما الحكيم يجيب بلغة الروح." The fool speaks in a borrowed tongue, but wisdom answers in the language of the soul. The downfall of Marcus Thorne was not a slow decline, it was a detonation. The moment Lena finished speaking, the spell of his power was shattered, irrevocably and completely. The man on the stage was no longer a titan of industry. He was a common criminal, exposed by his own words, his own hubris. His face, which had been pale with shock, now became a mottled, ugly shade of red. He opened his mouth, but only a strangled, pathetic sound emerged. The carefully constructed edifice of his life, built on a foundation of lies and the bones of smaller men, crumbled to dust in a single, cathartic moment. His allies, the senators and CEOs who had been clapping for him only minutes before, now looked away, their faces masks of cold neutrality, as they created as much physical and metaphorical distance as possible. The media, who had once chronicled his every triumph, now descended upon him like a pack of wolves, their camera flashes like a volley of gunfire, their shouted questions a merciless barrage. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a terror that was primal and absolute, the terror of a king who had just watched his own execution. He was alone, utterly and completely, adrift in the wreckage of his own making, a monument to the fatal flaw of arrogance. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Lena finally exposed the truth. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Before the gala had even ended, the first online news articles were already live, the video of Lena's speech going viral across the globe. By morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission had announced a formal investigation into Thorne Capital. The company's stock, when the market opened, plummeted with a speed that was historic. Investors, including the man from the UAE who had witnessed the initial confrontation, pulled their capital so fast it created a financial black hole. Thorne's empire, which had taken a lifetime of ruthless ambition to build, was dismantled in less than a week. He was facing a mountain of lawsuits and the very real prospect of criminal charges that would send him to prison for years. The parking lot he had threatened to turn Æthelgard into became a metaphor for his own legacy, a barren, empty space where something of value had once stood. His name, once a symbol of power, was now a synonym for fraud and disgrace, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms he was now forever banished from. A week later, Lena sat in a quiet cafe, the morning sun warming her face. Her phone rang and the caller ID showed an international number. It was the investor from the UAE. He did not offer condolences or pity. He offered respect. He told her that in his world, integrity and wisdom were the most valuable commodities, and she possessed them in greater measure than anyone he had ever met. He had been so moved by her courage and so impressed by her profound intellect that he wanted her to join his global investment fund. The position he offered was not a token of charity. It was a role created specifically for her. He wanted her to be his firm's senior cultural and ethical advisor, to use her deep understanding of language, culture, and ethics to guide their investments, to ensure they built things of lasting value, rather than destroying them for short-term profit. He wanted her to use her voice, not to answer insults, but to shape the future. For the first time in years, Lena felt the future not as a threat, but as a boundless, sunlit horizon. In the end, Lena's victory was not loud or vengeful. It was quiet, profound, and deeply healing. She accepted the position, and with her new salary, she was able to move her father from the sterile nursing facility into a beautiful, sun-drenched private suite with the best round-the-clock care money could buy. One afternoon, she brought him a gift. It was a magnificent hand-woven tapestry from Damascus, its intricate patterns telling a story of 1,000 years of artistry. It was a piece identical to one his company used to import, a piece of the beauty that Marcus Thorne had tried to reduce to mere office art. She unrolled it before him, the vibrant colors filling the room. Her father's eyes, which had so often been clouded with pain and confusion, cleared. He looked at the tapestry, then he looked at his daughter, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. He reached out his hand, the one that still had some movement, and gave her fingers a firm, decisive squeeze. No words were needed. In the language of the soul, he had told her everything she needed to hear, that he was proud, that he was at peace, and that his legacy was not in the business he had lost, but in the incredible woman he had raised. If Lena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.